Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about Ravenous. This 1999 cannibal-horror-comedy film went through 3 directors in a troubled production. We discuss how it successfully critiques American consumption and manifest destiny despite its financial failure.
You can find our sources at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave a comment, or you can write us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Have you seen Ravenous? Do you like Neil McDonough? Chris, before the show starts, I think we should take care of some business.
I think we should too. So, listeners, we have decided that after 4 full years of doing this show, we're going to retire regular episodes of Super Context in May of 2020.
We're letting you know here because our Patreon supporters already have heard from us, and we've had discussions on the Patreon page, patreon.com/supercontext, but we don't want this to be a surprise to any of our regular listeners. So this is just to let you know, the next few months, we're going to hit as many of the gotta do it subjects as we can before we cease production, probably mid-May of this year.
Yeah, we wanted to give everybody a heads up before the show ended. So we've got 5 more months of episodes. By my count, that's almost 20 episodes before we retire the show. Look, I just want to say that doing the show has been really rewarding, especially being able to expand it by having a patron. But unfortunately, the production schedule has just been unsustainable for the 2 of us. We've got things to maintain due to our day jobs, our families, and all of our other creative projects. If you want more information about what we're going to do with the show after May, keep listening to the episode, and at the Patreon spot in the middle, we'll throw down some more information.
Okay, on to the show. Chris, how do people hassle you when they find out that you don't eat meat?
They lick me.
Is that right?
No.
Like they go right for the face, right there?
No, I don't really get hassled, but normally, especially now that I live in Portland,
right? It's
kind
just,
of a given.
It's regular, yeah.
But the closest thing I can point to as being quote hassled actually happened at Thanksgiving this year. So I called home to say hi to my family, who were all together eating the meal. And my uncle got on the phone with me and he said, "Hey, in your honor, we cooked a tofurkey this year." And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "No, just fucking with you."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Okay, cool." That's kind of how it goes.
Right. So introducing a topic about you to then not take it seriously.
Yeah. But also it was kind of an okay boomer moment because, it was like, all right, dude, well, while you're joking about that, like every fast food franchise in the country right now is incorporating these, what are they calling them now? Plant-based alternatives into their menus.
What they're calling them, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm asking, of course, because today's episode is all about a movie that's about eating meat.
Yeah. I sympathized with Guy Pearce when he throws up at the beginning. I was like, oh yeah. And I think I probably first saw this right around when I became vegetarian. Actually, yeah, because I started being vegetarian in like 97, 98. So
yeah, and it came out 99, right?
Yep. And actually, Charlie, I think we should probably do a little bit more clarification here because you and I adore this movie.
Oh my God, I love this fucking movie. I love it so much.
Yeah, me too. And rewatching it for this episode absolutely confirmed my belief. I was like, oh man, this is so good. But this is a movie that is not popular. It is a movie that a lot of people hate, and it's a movie that I don't think a lot of people have even heard of. It's 20 years old at this point.
It makes me so sad because I feel that the desire for it to be a cult movie, for it to be a kind of currency of some kind, that, because like with my brothers and I, we can say, well, Ravenous, or, oh, watch out for him. He's a real soldier. And these things mean something to each of us. We can pass meaning around.
Well, I would say, it is a cult film in the respect that, and we'll get into this, but it did terribly when it came out.
Yeah.
But it has been critically reappraised since it came out, and Shout Factory has re-released it on Blu-ray. So there is like a, quote, definitive edition that's out there. It's just how many people have access to that Blu-ray, When I went to go watch it, I was like, oh yeah, of course, it's not on any streaming services.
No.
And even when I went to the like super cool hip indie video store here in Portland, they had the Blu-ray, but the movies that are really popular there, they'll have 10 copies of the Blu-ray,
right.
Not a lot of people are going out and being like, I have to see Ravenous.
They had an archival copy.
They did. But let me argue, this is a movie that deserves attention, not just because it's fun, not just because it's well written, but because there is a fascinating production story behind how it got made. And there's some really interesting themes that have been dissected academically about this film, too.
The things about Ravenous that make it truly interesting stop people from enjoying it who come to it for its superficial reasons.
Yeah, that seems to be the case as well, and we'll get into that. A lot of people who saw it when it came out were like, ew, no, this isn't for me.
Yeah, this is not what was sold to me.
Because I in our notes, I hesitated to give it a genre assignment, but it is a mixture of like historical war film, black humor, and a horror film.
I think it's a horror film that has a deeply morbid sense of humor that is a period piece. I think that's I think at the top it's a horror film.
So this is interesting for me because, I've talked before, I'm a horror nut now, but growing up, I didn't consider myself a horror fan. But I watched movies like this and were like, oh, this is the best, and didn't think of it as horror because it wasn't Friday the 13th, you know?
Well, this was the stretch of time where if Guy Pearce was in a movie, I watched it.
Right, yeah.
That's what got me in the theater. And I was lucky that this movie I was going to watch that had Guy Pearce in it was also right up my alley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'd say, again, if anybody hasn't seen it, listeners, I highly recommend that you get a hold of it and watch it. It's fun. It's ludicrous. We're going to talk about all the reasons why. You might not want to have it spoiled for you, though. There are some fun twists and turns.
That's true. This is a movie that reveals the story in chunks, not always linearly. And so I'm dragging this moment out. So if anybody suddenly realizes, I do want to watch the movie, I've been thinking about it. That's why I got this podcast on the player. You can stop and go track down that one Blu-ray copy. Okay.
So let's stop beating around the bush. Rather than us try to summarize it for you, I found a summary written about it on Sci-Fi's page by Kaylee Donaldson that I think is pretty close. Donaldson says, Ravenous is inspired in equal parts by the Donner Party and the story of Alfred Packer, and the legend of Sawney Bean. Ravenous follows a second lieutenant named Boyd, who's played by Guy Pearce, who's a soldier whose cowardice during the battle in the Mexican-American War led him to inadvertently be labeled a war hero. To prevent further embarrassment, he's sent to join a tiny garrison of men at Fort Spencer, a military outpost in the mountains of California. I looked this up while I was watching it, Charlie. It seems like Fort Spencer is like Eastern California, like east of San Francisco, but just west of the line
it's still
of Nevada.
Northern. It's still northern,
it is,
with the good trees in the mountains.
It looks like it, yeah. It's right in the middle of all the green on Google Maps. That's how you know it has the good trees in the mountains.
Did you zoom in and try and find like a body or a cave
no, I
somewhere?
didn't. Okay, so the peace at Fort Spencer is soon spoiled by the frantic arrival of a mysterious man named Colquhoun, who's played by Robert Carlyle. Again, somebody who you and I think of as like amazing.
Everyone knows who he is, yeah.
But I don't think they do anymore.
Is it Begbie from Trainspotting?
Yeah.
And the leader of the Full Monty crew is Robert Carlyle.
Right. I actually think most people know him as a villain from a James Bond movie.
I do not acknowledge your attempt at recontextualizing Robert Carlyle.
So Carlyle shows up and he confesses that he and his entire party of travelers got lost in the wilderness and ate each other. They're cannibals. And he...
Hold on. The story is that they were trapped in the snow for 3 months and they ate each other. Just to make it clear.
Yeah, okay. They didn't just start eating each other.
Yeah, it wasn't like, oh God, what are we going to do?
As he says in the film, we ate the oxen, and then we ate all the horses, and then we ate my dog. That is a horrible Scottish accent.
So from Fort Spencer, a rescue party is sent to retrieve the remaining living team members. And that is when everything goes to shit. Yeah.
So this movie's nuts. It's totally crazy. Everything about it's crazy. The story is crazy. The production on it is nuts. It went through at least 3 directors. And
Chris, we just went through an episode in which we discussed how people call things crazy. We just did an episode about Batman Odyssey.
Yeah, let's not use crazy as an adjective.
Also one of the things we tried to say was, the crazy is not because of what happens in it. It's like the background of it anyway, so let's reframe. Why is Ravenous crazy? It is surprising. Yeah. It is full of weird shit that is attached to some actors that we find familiar, and there's like severe changes in tone.
I would say, especially now, if you watch it, the cast of this at the time were up and coming independent character actors who you probably didn't recognize yet. But now when you watch this, you're like, holy shit, that guy's been in like 17 TV shows I've watched, right? Like Jeremy Davies, Neil McDonough, half the cast of Justified is in this movie.
Well, there's that weird Ted Griffin connection. Anyway, let's continue. So yes, this movie is crazy. I agree with you, but also it's crazy in that it is, it's not like any other movie that I can think of.
No. And I think a lot of that has to do with how it was made. But primarily, and I didn't see a lot of this in the research, I think we can thank Ted Griffin. This had a really solid script. And so despite the fact that there was a lot of controversy on the set, Ted Griffin's script seemed to hold things together.
So let's introduce everyone to Ted Griffin. He's a screenwriter, and you probably have seen some of his work. He is American. He wrote the movie Matchstick Men that had Nicolas Cage in it. He wrote the movie Ocean's 11 that had a couple actors that people might know in it. He wrote for The Shield, and he wrote a movie called Tower Heist that I never saw. And his time on The Shield actually led to him collaborating with Sean Ryan to create a show called Terriers.
Oh, right. Yeah, I left that off the list. But yeah, that is part of his filmography.
I had to bring it up because Terriers is the most tragic one-season cancellation that I can think of.
So it's something you really enjoyed?
Oh, my God. Did you never watch it?
No.
Well, see, that's the thing, right? Nobody watched it because, like, what is this show?
But Ravenous is the same way. It's sure, like, there's plenty of people that you'd be like, you never watched it? And they'd be like, what? I've never even heard of this.
Terriers is so great, and Neil McDonough shows up at the end as the next bad guy.
Neil McDonough is delightful. I think most people nowadays probably know him as like one of the bad guys from the Green Arrow TV show. But he's just a delightful character actor. He just really chews up the scenery in this and everything he's in.
I had the weirdest thing happen. I was watching Grosse Pointe Blank, and Bobby Beamer, I don't know if you remember the movie, but the coke snorting car salesman who's just kind of a dick at the reunion, who wants to fight
vaguely familiar.
Martin Blank. It's Bull from Band of Brothers, one of the more admirable and down-to-earth cast members in Band of Brothers.
Now, you're bringing this up because McDonough's in Band of Brothers.
Just like Neil McDonough is in Band of Brothers and plays not really the same character as any of his other sort of, as you said, delightful, but also strange, villainous characters.
Isn't Jeremy Davies also in Band of Brothers?
I don't know.
No? Okay.
Maybe. Actually, there's a lot of people in Band of Brothers.
So,
Anyway.
all right, we're getting into film nerd territory here.
I
Where
am
we're
excited about
IMDbing this film.
I'm going to try and put this to my trivia mind to rest, but Ravenous makes me feel like, and let's talk about this and let's talk about this. It's just so energetic and eccentric.
Yeah, and I think it has a really strong script, to go back to Griffin. Griffin, it turns out, comes from a showbiz family. So like his parents and his brothers, they are directors and screenwriters and actors. So he was born into the industry.
Oh, he's a Whedon.
Yeah, right. Now, is that what we're calling it now? So let's get into the long, torrid story about the direction on this film. We're going to sort of reverse engineer this. So there were 3 different directors, and then we're going to talk about the producer who was sort of in charge of all of the directors, and we'll talk about the production company that the producer worked for.
Yeah. The 3 different directors are not simultaneous directors.
No.
It was the first hired director, the attempted replacement, and the eventual finished product director.
So the first is Milko Manchevsky. He is Macedonian. He's known for films I've never heard of. These films are Before the Rain, Dust, Shadows, Mothers, Bikini Moon, and Willow. It is not the George Lucas Willow. The only thing I think I've seen that he's done is he directed an episode of The Wire.
Did you look up which episode it was?
The name of it was in there. I can't remember it
Game
right now.
Day. It's the one where the 2 drug dealing groups, gangs, I guess is what you call them, play basketball.
Okay.
And
Charlie, the living IMDb, comes to the rescue again.
I went to make sure that it wasn't one of those Wire episodes that felt like, well, this is one of the crap ones. How'd this happen? Because he's a good director, is what I want to say. Is that he stepped into a TV job and did right. So he's not just someone who, well, you know what? I'm jumping ahead.
Because the reason why Charlie is making this caveat is because the story is that he was not a very nice man to work for on this film.
So let's get into it. An outlandish shitbag.
Yeah. So this is the story. It is apparently one of the studio versus director battles heralded as the worst in the history of Hollywood. And it came to a head on this film. So Fox 2000 president Laura Ziskin, who we will talk about shortly, flew from L.A. to Prague to fire Manchevsky. And the reason why was apparently, this is the side of the story. Manchevsky showed up to L.A. to discuss the project, and he immediately said Fox had to rent him either a convertible or a luxury car.
This is for the talks, for like
just
the
to talk about making a
pre-production
movie.
discussions of the movie.
Yeah. They were surprised that he then smashed up the rental car that they gave him. They didn't give him a luxury car. They demanded that he pay for it and several outstanding parking tickets on the rental car. By this point, he was in Prague making the film, supposedly. He quickly, quote, alienated crew members by telling them that they could talk to him only during certain hours, either at lunchtime or between 6:15 and 7:15 p.m. Production sources said he also refused to have either story or budget meetings with the other producers on the film. 1 week before production, he showed up to Fox with a whole bunch of storyboards that would have added another 2 weeks to the shoot. Fox were like, okay, cool, we'll do it. But then on the first day of production...
Actually, can I revise that? Fox
Sure.
was like, Jesus, fine.
On the very first day of production, he refused to sign off on either the budget or the schedule. Then the third day was lost because they just all sat around trying to come to an agreement. Just all of this stuff was bad. The other story is that the executive in charge of the shoot, Carla Hacken, at the time was a former agent who'd never overseen a production before.
So it was a true clusterfuck. And Ted Griffin said, we thought we're not going to get this movie made. When we're going to get emphysema because we're smoking so much. But the Ravenous footage that went back after this mangled start is what finally triggered the firing.
Yeah.
And the crew, of course, was happy. There's a crew member who was a production team member who said, we were so relieved. We begged the studio to fire him for months. And someone else said, these are anonymous quotes, I hope he stays in Hollywood jail for a long, long time.
Yeah. So reportedly, he was not beloved by anybody on the set. There was an interview with the directors of this film by Roger Clark that we'll have a link to in the show notes. And Clark says he called up Menchevsky when he was in Macedonia to ask for his version of this story. And
this is a lot later. This is as a retrospective of Ravenous. So there's no more lawyers involved in the process.
Menchevsky said this, quote, it was all about who's got a bigger dick. The Fox 2000 executive, Laura Ziskin, was micromanaging everything I did, vetoing technicians, casting down to even the smallest part. Yet it was me who put together that great cast. Every day I'd get notes on the rushes from her saying the uniforms were too dirty or there weren't enough close-ups of David Arquette. And then one day she just got on a plane unannounced and came over with the director of Home Alone 3 to replace me. But all the actors went on strike and Antonia Bird was called in. He said, you couldn't make it up. It's beyond satire. I have to say that Hollywood is full of the most miserable, unhappy people I have ever met, and I'm from the Balkans.
Okay. So he summarized the rest of the story right there at the end. When Ziskin flew to Prague to fire the first director, she brought who she hoped would be the second director, Raja Gosnell.
Let's list Gosnell's filmography, both before and since this film has come out, just to see how appropriate of a filmmaker they are
the
for
movie he had made
Ravenous.
Before this attempt to hire him for Ravenous was Home Alone 3. After this did not happen, he went on to make Big Mama's House, the Scooby-Doo movies, the Smurfs movies, and a movie called Show Dogs. I guess I need to read the description of this movie. Are you ready? Strap in, Chris.
All right, hit me.
Max, a macho, solitary Rottweiler police dog, is ordered to go undercover as a primped show dog in a prestigious dog show, along with his human partner, Will Arnett, to avert a disaster.
Please tell me it's live action.
Looks like it. Yep.
Oh, I want to watch this now. Oh, poor Will Arnett. He seems to make a lot of bad decisions.
No, I think rich Will Arnett, he seems to make a lot of movies.
So Raja Gosnell, before directing all of these movies that I would argue are either children's movies or like family-friendly romps.
Yeah, if Ravenous was in his filmography where it would have come, it would look insane. Because it was the Home Alone second sequel, and then all of these family-friendly movies, including, like, he was editor on a bunch more, including the Home Alone films and Mrs. Doubtfire.
Right, that's how he got the job working on the third Home Alone, is that he had edited the first two of them, yeah. So, okay, so Ravenous shuts down production for 2 weeks. Fox are supposedly searching for a replacement, and they bring out Raja Gosnell, and the story goes that everybody was just like, yeah, no, we're not working for this person.
Yeah, Rolling Stone says that he was rejected like a body denying a transplanted heart, that the whole cast just said, no, we will not do this. So
Robert Carlyle, the star of this film, was like, look, I've made independent films before with somebody named Antonia Bird. We've worked together on the films Priest and Face. The set was, quote, heavy and untenable, and now it's going on like a house on fire. The whole atmosphere has changed. So Carlisle convinces them to bring on Antonia Bird.
Now, no one should be sad about Gosnell. Obviously, he had the career, but the thing he did was he went back to L.A. and immediately started working on a Drew Barrymore romantic comedy.
Which I believe was produced by the same film company. We'll get to that shortly.
Well, clearly she wanted, Ziskin wanted him to work in the studio. Anyway.
So Antonia Bird was an English filmmaker. She worked on films like Safe, Priest, Mad Love, and Face. She also worked on television shows in the UK. She passed away in 2013. Ravenous is the last film in her filmography where she's listed as a director.
Yeah.
Everything else direction-wise was television after that. Film-wise, she was a producer.
And she died in 2013 kind of young. I think she was 62.
Yeah, I believe she had breast cancer.
So there's this big churn with Ravenous. And eventually one of the kind of co-starring roles, the villain in the movie, Robert Carlyle, gets his friend and either at the time or very soon after co-owner of a production company to come and be the fill-in director for this movie that was already in production.
So we've got this film that is basically all these actors are hanging out in Eastern Europe, just sitting there for 2 weeks waiting to make this film while Fox and the various directors argue about things. Antonia Bird shows up and she's seen as apparently like a troubleshooter who comes in and brings it all together.
It was 10 days of negotiation, with a cast over in Prague waiting to start shooting. And Bird said that the studios in Prague were horrible. And she was a young British socialist vegetarian director. And people point out that it just doesn't seem like this is who you would grab to fix a movie or to save a Hollywood movie.
But Bird comes in and says, and this is why I think the movie is so good, by the way, Bird realizes this isn't actually a movie that's about cannibalism. It's an allegorical movie about the state of the world that we're living in. And this is really important because, honestly, the very first time I saw this, when I was probably in my early 20s and it had just come out, I didn't pick up on that at all. I just thought it was a funny movie about people eating each other. But watching it now, it's really obvious.
Yeah, with the slightest bit of guidance, you can totally find the social satire that exists in it. It
starts, the very first shot is an American flag.
Yeah. And it's even more like pointed because Antonia Bird, she had just made the movie Mad Love, another Drew Barrymore romantic comedy.
And that was a disaster, and she had a lot of Hollywood problems with that.
Yeah, and she was ready to give Hollywood the business. She said that L.A. is the most cannibalistic society I've ever spent time in.
I tell you, there's a book to be written that just traces Drew Barrymore's entire life and career and looks at all of the branches that pop off of it that shows how Hollywood works behind the scenes.
You think that she's the Forrest Gump of Hollywood's
she's the Kevin
debauchery?
Bacon. Yeah.
Okay, Antonia Bird, she went to L.A. She did a Drew Barrymore movie. She almost did a Richard Gere movie, but really the stuff that
let's talk about the Richard Gere thing, though.
Okay.
She spent 18 months of her life developing this film for Richard Gere. And then at the last minute, he was just like, meh. And the way it was described was Richard Gere finally passed on it with what she felt was a wave of his hand.
Right. She is a auteur, like an art house filmmaker. She did movies that were about unions, about regular people. And then when she was encountering movie stars and in the Hollywood system, it just kind of, it didn't work for her. It didn't connect with her. And she said, nobody explained. It was just about business.
Yeah, that right there is the money quote, I think. That it describes this movie for sure, but I think it describes a lot of our conversations here on this show about how something got made and the tensions behind the scenes of what either made it fail or succeed.
Yeah, there's this astonishing thing that it is almost always true that It's just business, right? People are trying to make money. And then simultaneously, it is sometimes true that someone is doing a project, an artwork that is really important to them, you know? And it's amazing when those two things line up.
And it's
and both
rare,
work.
I think, too.
Totally rare.
Yeah. So later on, Bird is asked about her relationship with the production company, specifically with Ziskin, the producer on this. And she points out, she says, the schedule for filming this was, it was actually bonkers, and it was manipulative. And she says, I don't think it was actually Manchevsky's fault. He'd been stitched up big time, in my opinion. So she seemed to have sympathy for him, despite all of these horror stories that Fox said about his behavior during pre-production.
Yeah, so she came into the environment, and she does not now, or did not then, tell the story of, I keep thinking of her as alive, because I just found out that she died, by doing the research for the episode. She did not say, oh yeah, I came and saved a project from a crazy director. She basically said, yeah, Hollywood's completely fucked up, and I ended up on this picture.
I think she did it as a favor to Robert Carlyle, and
yeah,
coincidentally, she just happened to be a great filmmaker and was able to capture this.
Here's a description of her as a director. In person, Bird has that subtle, quiet ability to notice your wounds and make you feel fine about them. This is why actors love her. This is why she was able to soothe a jittery crew of 180 and a neurotic bunch of bereaved actors after the first director upped and left. I had to go in there, she said, and just be mum.
And by mum, she means mother.
Mother.
Yeah.
So she settled the production, and you and I love the movie that came out of it. But nothing is good. Nothing is wholesome. Nothing is unspoiled, because they took the movie away from her at the end of the production.
Yeah, she says later on that she's actually not happy with the finished product, and that in post-production, she lost control and authority over the film. She says that it bothers her, and this is a quote, I've had a whole new thought in the last 24 hours. I need a whole new cut of Ravenous for Europe. I'd love to build that into my budget for future films, one edit for the US and one for Europe. I felt that the voiceover on Ravenous was superfluous, as were the quotes at the beginning explaining everything. There's this disease of thinking that your audience is stupid, and they're not. You can go out to the poorest little town in the Mojave Desert, and you can sit down in a trailer park talking to people who are smarter and brighter than you are. They happen to be bagging groceries, and we're supposed to think that they're stupid, but they are not stupid.
There is a commentary track to Ravenous, I assume as part of the Blu-ray. And we have some quotes from that are pretty useful in understanding the movie. I have not been able to watch the movie with the commentary track, but I will. She says that in this movie, she wanted to kind of connect to the Dracula myths. She went sort of old school too, and that she was using tongue-in-cheek iconography, specifically wolves howling nearby and a yellow crescent moon. She was using Hollywood cliches as kind of a signal jammer.
Yeah.
But people think that was maybe her thinking that the audience is not stupid, but forgetting that the audience is rushed and uses marketing and the superficial pieces of the movie to understand what they're getting into right away. And that is where there was a lot of dissatisfaction between audience and the film.
So rewatching it, I noticed that stuff this time around. Like, she'll do a lot of things, like she'll cut to a full moon and you'll hear wolves howling in the background. But I think that she is onto something with this difference between the US and Europe.
Yeah, there's multiple smash cuts that were punchlines, that were like almost cartoonish sort of commentary through the images on the story that was going on.
Mm-hmm. And all conventional wisdom in terms of the reviews are that the reason why it didn't work here in the States is that most people watched it and didn't understand the humor part of it. That they just saw a sick movie about cannibalism that was like almost reveling in the gore.
Right. Or a horror movie that didn't go far enough. That like pulled back from the actual gross out factor.
So let's move on to talk about the cast. There aren't a lot of quotes from the cast members, as we have, just over our fanboyishness about this film, discussed already. It has an amazing cast. Robert Carlyle, Guy Pearce, Jeffrey Jones plays the leader, the colonel, I guess, at the fort. You've got Jeremy Davies, Neil McDonough. Everybody makes a big deal out of David Arquette being in this movie. I think he's probably the worst member of the cast. Well,
this was coming off of Scream, right? Like he was a known quantity. John Spencer. West Wing fame is in
I think
there.
This is one of the last features he made.
That's what I kept reading, is that this was the last movie he did before he said, okay, I'm going to concentrate on West Wing. And he died while he was doing the West Wing television show.
Yeah. So real quick, we talked about this off air, but I think let's just address it briefly. One of the things we thought was going to be part of the story is that if you're familiar with Jeffrey Jones, he was arrested for possession of child pornography and soliciting a 17-year-old boy. That happened in 2002, however, so it was 3 years after this movie came out. We weren't quite sure on the timing, so we were like, one of the questions we have is, why does Jeffrey Jones keep getting hired onto big productions if he's got this black mark on his record? And this film doesn't seem to apply there. Nobody knew about his predilections yet.
Right. And the discussion of Deadwood is for another time.
However, I will say, like, it makes watching him in this movie even creepier. Like, after you know about his personal life.
Because he's a stealth bad guy.
Yeah.
In the movie. And there's a certain, like, Jeffrey Jones is the principal from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Oh, no. Right? Surely everybody knows him as the bad guy from Howard the Duck, right?
Yes. You know what? You're totally right. My mistake, choosing the more popular movie. Jeffrey Jones is a known quantity in like big movies, and then he's still around, which is strange.
I think the thing most people probably know him from now is Deadwood. Yeah, he's the newspaper guy on Deadwood.
Yeah. So let's put that aside, because it's not part of this movie.
Yeah, but it was just something that kind of piqued our interest when we first started digging.
So Robert Carlyle said, I never saw Ravenous as a horror film. The other themes that are woven into the piece were the reasons that I did it. And so that's interesting. I understand why he would say I never saw it as a horror film. I still think it's a horror movie that has much more to it. And he's saying that it was the much more to it that brought him into the production.
I think the big difference that we're finding here is that the Europeans who worked on this film are saying this isn't a horror movie, it's a farce. And the Americans are saying, oh, this is a horror movie.
Well, is it a farce or a satire on Americanness?
Well, that's what we have to dissect later on.
Because Carlyle said, it amuses me that the film is set in California. That amuses me because everything about California is about appearance and this desire for youth and trying to keep yourself looking young, vitality, virility, all that. And that's exactly what my character is doing and saying. He discovers that cannibalism is going to keep him young and virile. So he was the first true Californian.
Let me geek out about Carlyle for a minute. He has since gone on to be in a bunch of horror movies in which he is absolutely terrifying. Have you seen the sequel to 28 Days Later? 28 Weeks Later?
No.
He's, spoilers for I think it's like a 10-year-old movie at this point, but he's the main antagonist in that. He is like a zombie that chases his family around for like 2 hours in that film, and it is fucking scary. He's a scary guy.
How many horror movies has he been in? Like, does it seem like he's now being drawn into productions like that?
No, I mean, I'm looking at his filmography here, and I would say Ravenous and that are like the main like horror films. He's mostly in independent films, and then, the things that, like I said, I think people know him from The World Is Not Enough, the James Bond movie, and Trainspotting.
So here's some more of what he thought of what the movie was, what it needed. He says, I think it required humor. Cannibalism is so dark, it needs humor. If you are going down that road of dark, 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 you need the humor to counterbalance it. It's entertainment. I hope the audience gets entertainment out of it. And maybe if people start to talk about the film, they will maybe begin to see some of the metaphors that I mentioned earlier about modern day California. And he talks about the director switch. Once Milko had gone, it was vital for me to try and find someone I could get along with. Antonia is a great friend of mine, a great collaborator, so it seemed an obvious choice, really. Now, Charlie finds it interesting that he says once Milko was gone, it was vital for me to try and find someone I could get along with. And that might just be how he's saying it, or it might also say that Carlisle was a driving force in the production.
Probably at that point, yeah. And you have to imagine too, right? Like, you have gone through all the pre-production and flown out to this location. Everybody's there on set and you're just sitting there for 2 weeks. You're probably asking yourself, why am I doing this and how good could this possibly be for my career if it just gets made by somebody, some quote unquote hack they bring in.
That's when you start thinking oh God, I hope I get the next job before this piece of shit comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here's some more detail about the production company he had with Bird. He says it's a development company rather than a production company called Four Way Films. The biggest problem in this country, and particularly in Britain, is that scripts don't get the chance to develop. So they were essentially a company that allowed people to work on the scripts and develop properties before they get into the system where they have to be made or disappear.
Yeah. One more geek out moment before we move on to talk about the production companies. Best scene in this movie for me, hands down. It's maybe 5 seconds long. Is Jeffrey Jones is going through and he's explaining who all of the various people are that work at the force.
This is one of the smash cuts I was talking about.
It is, yeah. And I have to believe that this is Antonia Bird's doing. And so he gets to the Neil McDonough's character part and he says the thing that Charlie mentioned earlier, he's a real soldier. It just cuts to Neil McDonough shirtless, standing in a rushing river and screaming at the top of his lungs.
So flexed.
Yeah.
And if you watch the trailer for Ravenous, that's a cut from a scary moment. It's like it uses that smash cut to that moment as if he is actually in trouble.
But it's comedy. Yeah.
Total comedy.
Yeah. This movie's so great. So, okay. Let's stop geeking out. Let's talk about the production companies. So Fox 2000, we already mentioned, we'll get into the details about that company, but they weren't the ones who initially ponied up the money for this. That was Heyday Films, which is a British studio that was founded by producer David Heyman. That's why it's called Heyday Films. This was the first feature that this production company made. They have since gone on to produce the Harry Potter movies. So this is a big deal company now. But at the time, they start up a production company and they start putting this together and all this shit is going wrong with it. They must have been terrified.
Yeah. I mean, or they might not have recognized how badly it was going at first. A real sort of water slowly heating up around you kind of situation. Because they got Fox money.
Yeah. Yeah. So Fox is the big entity that comes in. Fox 2000 is different from 20th Century Fox. It's a sister studio. It's now owned by Disney, but not for long. We'll get to that. They specialize in making, quote, independent films in mid-range releases that are largely targeted for underserved groups. Huh. So I think that just means indie movies for niche audiences. The company is to be dissolved in May of 2020 as we're recording this.
So Disney doesn't care about independent films and mid-range release?
It was formed in 1994 by Laura Ziskin, who is the producer that we've been talking about the whole time. She was the president of the company. She left in the year 2000. Here are the two movies that they produced on either side of Ravenous to give you an idea of what they're focusing on. It's so bizarre to me. The Thin Red Line, which is a pretty well-known Terrence Malick movie, and then Never Been Kissed, which is another Drew Barrymore romantic comedy. I think we're talking about 3 different Drew Barrymore romantic comedies that are in orbit of Ravenous.
No, wait. I think, Never Been Kissed is the one that the guy who did Home Alone 3 went on to do.
Great.
And that was also starring David Arquette.
Great. So
once he got killed in the movie, he went home.
He just immediately went and shot that with the other director. I also read somewhere, I think Fight Club was a Fox 2000 picture, and that came out in 99 as well. So to give you an idea of the kind of movies, when they say independent films in mid-range releases for underserved groups, that's what they're talking about. Fight Club, The Thin Red Line, and a Drew Barrymore comedy.
How are white people 18 to 35 underserved?
That is a larger question for another time. I think it's a question people have been asking since 1999 and even further back.
Okay. Moving on.
So Laura Ziskin, we've brought her name up a lot. We haven't really given you a bio of her. She has also passed away. Sorry, she's the one who passed away from breast cancer.
Yeah, Bird had thyroid cancer.
Okay. So that was in 2011 that she passed away. Bird was 2013, I believe. Laura Ziskin was an American film producer. The thing that she's the most well known for is Pretty Woman. She was the producer on that. She also was the first woman to produce the Academy Awards alone, and I believe she did that a couple times. She started off, this is an interesting story, as Sally Field's business partner. They started a production company together called Fogwood Films, and they produced the movies Murphy's Romance and No Way Out.
Oh my God, No Way Out. Have you ever seen No Way Out?
I think I have, but it doesn't stick with me the way it does with you.
Well, if it didn't stick with you, then you didn't see it.
Okay.
Oh my God, that movie's so good.
So then Ziskin goes on to work for Touchstone Pictures, Fox 2000. Then she leaves Fox 2000 after this debacle and goes and works on Columbia Pictures. During the filming of the film What About Bob, she reportedly also had spirited disagreements with Bill Murray on set. So she's known for getting into arguments with the creative side.
Right. And she didn't settle down after her Ravenous trouble.
She also produced the first 3 Spider-Man movies at Columbia. So that's one of the things that she's known for as well. And I believe like one of the last movies in production with her when she passed away was the Amazing Spider-Man films with Andrew Garfield.
You know, I've always, in the back of my mind, whenever I think about Hollywood and executives, I always have a little bit of that just sort of disbelief of how badly they can do their jobs, it seems, and then still continue to do the jobs. Like, it truly has a, like 3 strikes and you go play in another game kind of culture, like, but then sometimes people get chewed up just by having one failed movie. So I would love to find out more about what is the thing that allows people to move from failed production to failed production until they hit something big, and what's the thing that just stops them in their career tracks.
I have mentioned this before on the show, and if I remember correctly, you've chastised me for how I've used this term to describe certain producers.
Oh, okay.
In my experience working for media companies, people like this are falling upward. There seems to be no bottom for them, that they can fuck up over and over and over again, but they can somehow bullshit their way into another position where then they can, quote, succeed. I'm not saying that's what happened here with her.
So do you think that it's just it's the character? It's like the being able to talk their way upward as they fall?
No, I think it's just that nobody knows what they're doing. And so they're all pretending that they know what they're doing, and whoever pretends the best gets the gig.
Right. See William Goldman's book, Nobody Knows Anything.
Sure. So that was a huge grand statement. I probably just offended a bunch of people. But in my experience, whenever I've worked with like, quote, producers that are doing a bad job, or I've heard stories from other people in creative industries working for producers who are doing a bad job, they always go on to get a better position at another company after they screw everything up at the company that they've been at previously.
Yeah. It just seems like it's a game of who can leave earlier so that they don't get tarred with the
right. Well, yeah, and it's sort of a matter of like whatever company they land at next better make sure that none of the other creators in their orbit are there to be like, whoa, red flag, right? You know, because otherwise you just look at their resume and go, okay.
I'm all over the map on this because Ravenous was always this sort of sealed experience for me. You know, I watched it when it came out. I loved it. I've hung on to bits and pieces of it for years. I've never gone back to revisit it though. It's sort of like, who am I going to watch it with? All right. Especially
your children.
Now. Yeah, exactly. My kids, my brothers really is who I would watch it with. And then I found out that it was just a shit show. Behind the film, and I'm like trying to work that out for myself, and I shouldn't be surprised. That's been a thing that happened before while doing this podcast, but I guess it's been a little while since I encountered something that revealing the background it so changes my understanding of how it happened, how the movie came to be.
Yeah, that's the mission of Super Context, and I think it has a lot to do with understanding how everything gets made by looking at a case study like this. But let's see. All right, I mean, based on the limited information that we have, I would say Ziskin didn't, quote, fail, right? Ziskin chose a good script by a good screenwriter, paired it with a director that seems to have been a little bit narcissistic. That didn't work out. Ultimately, the creative forces on this film won out. The screenwriter, the actors involved, brought this director who made it a tenable project. It just didn't work in the market afterwards.
Yeah, and if you wanted to tell the story as still a success or still competence for Ziskin, she had a production that was in trouble that still made it to completion. Yeah,
exactly. We'll get into the money that was lost on this, though.
That's really what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. But real quick, let's finish off talking about the creative team. So the score on this film is something that you will notice if you watch it for the first time. Yeah. It's a bizarre score, but it sticks with you. It is. I went looking for it yesterday to see if it was available on streaming services, and I couldn't find it. So now it's my mission to get a copy of the Ravenous score.
You're going to find that one vinyl copy that's left over.
I don't think they
were all remaindered and destroyed.
Kaylee Donaldson from Sci-Fi talks about the score. It was put together by Michael Nyman and Damon Albarn at the time of Blur fame, who has now gone on to be in Gorillaz and many other big projects. So Michael Nyman was known for the soundtrack to Jane Campion's The Piano. He teams up with Damon Albarn. They do what is called, quote, a bluegrass drone that mixes era-appropriate instrumentation with classic symphonies, spirit-rousing ragtime, and Beverly Hillbillies-style getaway music.
That's overstating it a little bit at the end, but yeah, there is humor and whimsy in the music, while at the same time the music operates as a sound effect and as sound design, especially like when Robert Carlyle is becoming the Wendigo for the first time, and he's doing that thing with his hands, and the music is going. It's really good. It's really good.
Another reviewer named Shannon Ellery Hubel says that the soundtrack shifts between ominous thumping rhythms, strange folk-tinged noodling, and some nearly elegiac military-sounding brass. In one really notable moment, the score transitions abruptly from some really dire, suspense-filled notes to old-fashioned hillbilly music that is totally gleeful and shifts the tone of the sequence entirely. That's the scene that Charlie's talking about.
Yeah. Hubble says Ravenous is a miracle in that a film this strange came out of a major studio intact. And I have to wonder if it's in part because of its remarkable score that we have what we have. It's a tonal mishmash, going grisly and goofy, often at the same time, then barreling straight into broader philosophical ideas of morality and American colonialism. Would the film work without its incredibly nimble score tying it all together? I'm not sure.
And then we get this gem. Louise H.C. writes about this film at Bloody Disgusting and reveals that another problem with the film behind the scenes was that the soundtrack was subject to controversy because Damon Albarn and Michael Nyman were forced to, quote, compete for credit due to increasingly confusing production demands.
Yeah, Hubble actually described them working together as a non-collaboration.
Right.
In that it seems quite possible that Michael Nyman did a score for Ravenous, and Damon Albarn did a score for Ravenous, and then Bird and other production folks used some of this and some of that.
It's fascinating. So it doesn't sound like, that they were particularly like collaborative in how they put this together.
But it is hard for people to recognize that. Even Louise at Bloody Disgusting says, Nyman and Albarn juxtapose silly banjo compositions with epic instrumentals. So it's unclear how much they work together and how much they both just contributed to the score.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we take a break, and when we come back, we can talk about how much money this film lost.
All right, Chris. Now, back to that business that we started at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, this is bittersweet, but this is our patron spot, and we'll use this spot to also explain a little bit more about our intentions going forward with the podcast. So, as we announced at the top, we are going to retire regular episodes as of May of 2020. We are, however, going to keep the Patreon campaign going, and you might be wondering, well, why would I be a patron for a show that's no longer producing episodes? We'll explain that. But first of all, we just want to thank the community that's helped to create and transform the show. Your support has helped us do things like pay our hosting fees, cover our expenses for the media artifacts that we research, and update our recording setup for the production that you're hearing right now.
Yeah, this show was made so much better by becoming a Patreon-supported podcast, and I've enjoyed being challenged and supported by our community and some of the rewards that we have provided for them. When we cease production of regular episodes in May of 2020, we want to continue the Patreon so that we can keep the public RSS feed active and free. I mean, we want people to continue to discover this show, dig into the archives. We've gotten a lot of wonderful positive feedback about how this is a useful and good podcast for people to listen to. Yeah. And that it's not temporary. You know, we talk about enough stuff in enough different time periods that this is, dare I say, timeless? No, I'll just say not attached to any particular contemporary media release.
So here's the deal we're thinking about offering, and we're having a conversation about this in our Patreon community right now, but we're looking at rewarding everyone who pledges at least $1 to our Patreon campaign after May of 2020 with access to the entire back catalog, plus all of our formerly behind the paywall patron content, including
like the minisodes and the Super King context.
Yeah, as well as we will produce a new mini episode every month where Charlie and I just kind of casually talk about what we've been consuming and observing in media and answer questions that the patrons pose to us.
Yeah, this is not about us not wanting to talk to each other anymore. So we'll still record a little bit.
Right. So what's coming up on the show, you might ask? Well, we've got episodes coming about The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, which is a book, and Trout Mask Replica by Captain Beefheart,
which is a conundrum.
So here are the rewards that are still going to be available to you that we are still going to produce for the next 5 months. Access to our outtakes and blooper reels, bi-weekly bonus mini episodes, and we are still going to produce monthly Super King Context episodes until May. In fact, this month, God help us, we are going to do the Dark Tower movie.
I'm so looking forward to it because I haven't seen it yet and I don't know what I'm getting into.
I have, and I do. So let's use this spot now to thank all of the people who have helped us get this far with the patron. So thank you to Juan Patton, who is our newest patron.
Also, thank you to Alex Laird, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, Andy Riggs, BB Schwells, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Billy Whitehouse, Brian Chovnick, Caroline Zoids, Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dave Jordan, and Dave Wachter.
Thank you to Eilish Phillips, Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, Ira James Udiskin, Jason Puckett, Jess Staten, Joseph Vallejo, Junta/Cult, Carmela Padovich, and Kate Sharon.
Thank you to Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirvila, Lee Fowler, Liliana Gill, Lokesh Dakar, Luigi Oswego, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, and Nathan Weatherford.
Thank you also to Neil G. McGuire, Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bowe, Philip, R.M. Rhodes, Rainadin, Matt and Rachel, that's a podcast, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, and Roman Marichek.
Thank you to Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Simon Workman, Tara Mishak, Thomas Tremberger, Veal Height, and Whitney Buchanan.
We really appreciate all of you, our patrons, for not only supporting us here on the show, but for also having a good time with us both on the patron community and on social media. So thank you. If you want to join that community, go ahead and check us out at patreon.com/supercontext.
And we're back. To answer your question from before the break, at least $10 million.
If not more. Yeah, so the budget for this was $12 million. Just in North America, the gross was a little over $2 million. That doesn't give us worldwide, but I can't imagine it was all that much more. And then we're not factoring in the marketing budget.
Right, costs associated with getting it out there in the world. And it clearly had a thorough and failed marketing campaign.
So it lost money. Wasn't particularly well received, at least here in the United States. Has a 45% on Rotten Tomatoes out of 60 reviews. The user rating is 5.61 out of 10. So that's an F, no matter how you cut it.
This is the part that just doesn't make sense to me. I feel like this is a movie that if you put the work into it, that if you cared to review it, you would review it better. You know what I mean?
It's a delight, but I think it's an acquired taste, and I think, no pun intended, and right. I think that, what they were saying earlier, we'll talk about this some more, but that it had a very European sense of humor for something that was produced for an American market. I was thinking about it. There are some times when I watch British television, particularly British television comedies, and I'm like, I'm an Anglophile. And I don't get this. Right. Why is this
tone
funny?
Is beyond me. I'm not clear on what I'm supposed to get from this.
And I just think that that's an entirely different cultural approach to the world that isn't in our DNA. You and I are a little bit more susceptible to it, so we liked this movie. But I think the audience and their wallets were not susceptible to it. And yeah, the trailer, I mean, it made it look like it was, what's that movie where Anthony Hopkins is in Alec Baldwin are killing a bear? What's that?
The Edge.
Yeah, it looked like that. This film borders, it goes from having like a slasher quality, like Friday the 13th or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, to like Benny Hill style farcical running through the woods, giggling and
Well, that scene at the very beginning has this moment where a whole table of soldiers eat steak.
Yeah.
And I think that was when I realized, I'm going to have to pay attention, or something is happening here, because the sound of the forks and knives on the plates gets really loud, and the meat going into their mouths and the chewing sounds and the sucking sounds and all that. It's like this fugue until you see Guy Pearce freak out and run away to throw up. And that's sort of it's almost like that's your ticket into the movie. Oh yeah,
I'm sure Bird sat down and was like, this is the way to establish the tone for this film so everybody knows what we're getting into. And they just didn't get it.
Let's read some reviews. Ken Hanley in Fangoria said, Bird also had the luck. So this is kind of in a good review. Bird also had the luck of having an excellent crew behind her as well, who were able to translate her surreal and unique vision for the film to a T. Ted Griffin's script is incredibly well written, injecting emotion and actual American legend into a tale of desperation, obsession, and literal consumption. Anthony B. Richmond's cinematography is incredibly impressive, adding a visual consistency and some occasionally striking Raimi-esque camera work that lends itself to the overall strange aura surrounding the narrative. And then here, back to the music. The music also helps meld together the radically shifting tones in the film, with the score by Blur's Damon Albarn and composer Michael Nyman elevating the sense of danger and peculiarity in the proceedings.
So Simon Abrams gave a review of this. Again, we'll have a link to it in the show notes. And mentioned the advertising campaign, saying that Fox had a very generic advertising campaign that suggested that Ravenous was, quote, doomed from the start. And it didn't really have any big stars in it. I mean, at the time, I think the only people who knew who Robert Carlyle and Guy Pearce were like probably indie nerds. Well, I guess Guy Pearce had been in LA Confidential at that point.
Yeah. And here's the thing. There's only so many folks who will go see a movie because of the actor who's in it, unless that actor is one of the movie stars. And Guy Pearce has never been a movie star.
But you started off the episode by saying he's the reason why you started watching the film.
Well, I'm one of those indie nerds.
Yeah. And so they also mentioned that Antonia Bird's most commercial film before this was the Drew Barrymore romantic comedy that she made, which, as we know, was a disaster for her. So Abrams says it's not surprising that Ravenous only grossed about 1/6 of its $12 million production budget.
Yeah, when Abrams tries to describe the ad campaign, here's the phrase: "Look out, here come giant disembodied lips."
Yeah, so the Blu-ray, that's the new Blu-ray from Shout Factory, that's the cover, is the lips.
His lips, sort of a weird Rocky Horror version of Ravenous. Alex Morris wrote, despite her sterling efforts, magnificent direction, and sense of nihilistic horror, Ravenous was considered a failure. So this is retrospective. Critics at the time failed to comprehend its unusual mix of horror and jet black humor. Adding to its endless list of problems was a terrible marketing campaign that failed to grasp any of the themes of the film. Pitched as some sort of tongue-in-cheek Deliverance ripoff, there we go back to the music, trailers and posters from the time show marketers just didn't get it. 2 decades on, and things have changed. With the DVD and Blu-ray re-release, a new era of critics has been able to reevaluate Ravenous.
Okay. So I feel like we've told the story of how it got made and how it was received pretty well. Let's talk about some sort of the deeper stuff, like how it represented the world and what the themes were. So we already mentioned, like, this had a female director, which was unusual at the time. It's unusual now.
Extremely unusual for the kind of movie it was, too.
Yeah. And probably only had a female director because of all of the, production problems behind the scenes. It was only because Robert Carlyle was like, this is a friend of mine.
Yeah.
But it turned out for the better.
Yeah. Now, as Ken Hanley said in Fangoria, Griffin put actual American legend into his script. And that's where we come back to Kaylee Donaldson from Sci-Fi, describing the monster in this movie. So
let's set the tone here for real quick, in case listeners haven't seen the film. So the antagonist of this film is the Wendigo myth that has been popularized by horror films like this. And that is a Native American mythology / legend. This film has 2 Native American characters in it, George and Martha.
George and Martha. You should we should hit that pretty hard, because that's the kind of American satire that we get from a UK filmmaker.
So they live at the fort with these soldiers. They're siblings. George doesn't speak English. Martha does. And they're basically guides. They're the ones who take the soldiers in and out of the fort, out to the wilderness, to sites like this cave or the next settlement or whatever. There's a scene where George very explicitly pulls out a bunch of skins with symbols on them and shows them to Guy Pearce and Jeffrey Jones and explains the Wendigo myth as in like broken English. And then Martha is also consulted on it later on in the film. So this film went to the effort of actually having Native American characters in it.
Mm-hmm. Even in the description of the, I can't not hear George say Wendigo, so that's how I'm going to say it. But in describing the Wendigo, the explicit connection to communion and the Eucharist is made.
Right.
So when Jeffrey Jones says, George, no one does that anymore, do they? He says, in his language, he says, every Sunday white men eat what they say is the body of Jesus Christ.
Right. So it's Algonquin folklore in the film. I'm not sure if that's true in real life. I haven't done the research on the Wendigo in a while to know where it comes from.
More than one critic says something along the lines of, "Oh, this is kind of an Eastern thing," and it seems like I guess George and Martha were shipped out. Like they make mention that this is kind of a mishmash, but it's also, you and I are not scholars of this kind of myth, so we kind of go with what people seem to know.
I would also just mention representation-wise, I think Martha is the character who comes out the best at the end of this film, right? Like, she is clearly kind of above it all in terms of the ignorance that we see from all of the characters in this film, from her brother to all of the white men that she's surrounded by.
And everyone is ethically compromised, even our hero. Because the reason that Guy Pearce is part of this story is because he's a coward and he played dead in a battle and was dragged with all the other corpses into a fort. Mm-hmm. And then blood from the corpses in the wagon dripped down into his mouth, which made him superhuman. You know, the
Wendigo stuff in this film, the powers and rules of the Wendigo are a little wonky, but yes, he has already had experience with the taste of man flesh.
Right. And he's been compromised. And when he meets Robert Carlyle out in the woods, it's a kindred spirit more than it is a monster.
So this is more about the Wendigo theme throughout it by Kaylee Donaldson. Kaylee says, in some indigenous communities, Wendigo psychosis is connected to destructive greed. And here in the film, cannibalism is the ultimate representation of manifest destiny. Down to the point that Carlyle straight up says this is manifest destiny.
And the idea behind the eating, right, is that this creature, this psychosis, when the person who has it eats, they want to eat more. Yeah. They're never full. The more they eat, the more they want to eat.
I don't know about you, but my experience initially with the Wendigo myth comes from 2 places. Pet Sematary and Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics had like a villainous Hulk-like character called the Wendigo. And the rules were pretty similar in that, like, the way in which you become a Wendigo is like you have to eat another human being somewhere within the borders of Canada, and then you turn into this giant white furry beast.
Okay, moving on from Manifest Destiny. In order to claim every step of nation before them, the original settlers to America. So Kaylee writes, decimated. She of course means devastated. Decimated both the landscape and its native residents. They didn't do it just because they could. They did it because they felt they had the God-given right to do so. In that context, eating your fellow man in search of the ultimate mastery of your domain feels like a logical conclusion. Ravenous, the film, is just smart enough to connect the dots and show a discomforting truth that a lot of people had way too much fun devouring what wasn't to be touched.
Yeah. So Kaylee ends their piece by saying, unfortunately, there isn't enough focus that's put on the actual Native American aspects of the mythology in this film. There are, however, indigenous actors in the cast, but most of the film is focused on the white men. That's true. I do think, though, like, to Bird's credit, I think that I think the camera hints that, like, the real protagonists of this story are Martha and George.
Yeah,
Martha's the last person we see in the film walking away from the settlement like, enough. Like, I can't deal with this anymore.
There's almost like, a reframing of the end of the movie would show that Martha was a resourceful and brave person who escaped some monstrous figures fighting around her.
By contrast, the actual leader of the fort, the general in charge of all of these white soldiers, played by John Spencer, is last seen ignorantly sipping on the broth of this cannibalistic flesh of one of the majors, and just going,
and thus starting the whole process over again.
Right.
A writer named DiMarco wrote an essay that, quote, examines Antonia Bird's film Ravenous as an appropriative text that invokes the Wendigo myth and evaluates cannibalistic discourse more broadly in order to critique Western cultural crisis.
Okay, so this is interesting. So the argument is that it is cultural appropriation that Ravenous is using the Wendigo myth, but at the same time, Griffin and the other filmmakers are using the Wendigo myth to critique how Westerners have influenced and mistreated Native Americans.
Yeah. And in this little ironic spiral, DiMarco relies on Margaret Atwood's lectures about the Wendigo that she gave at Oxford.
Yeah, so for background, I left a lot of this out of the notes here, but Margaret Atwood apparently tackled the Wendigo in one of her books. I believe it's called Oryx and Crake.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole huge chunk of this article that's like, here's how Margaret Atwood sets it up. And then it compares Atwood's setup to how Ravenous sets it up.
Yeah. And you can find those lectures or this particular lecture in a book called Strange Things, The Malevolent North in Canadian Literature. So in those lectures, as DiMarco says, Atwood defines the Wendigo as a mythical creature with a ravenous hunger for human flesh that lived in the eastern woodlands of the northern United States and Canada, which is often associated with winter, quote, a time of scarcity, which gives rise to hunger, which gives rise to selfishness. And possession by a Wendigo signals a human's spiritual selfishness and greed. Almost a ghost tale, right? Almost the righteous are not possessed, only the weak. And then DiMarco goes on to say, the Wendigo often emerges during times of imperial assertion when the story is being used by non-native storytellers, since imperialism relies upon an uncompromising path towards domination and its negative impact on people and their environments. So it's almost like the Wendigo story can only be a critique of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism if someone who is part of that structure uses the story. Because the story is not about that if you're not part of that system.
Right. And well, think about most of the Wendigo stories that we know. The ones I just mentioned, right? They're all about white people becoming Wendigos. They're not about native people becoming Wendigos.
Yeah. And it's a really explicit, like, opposition. You know, good guys don't become this thing, right? Only bad guys. But that's not exactly the way the story works in indigenous people's narratives.
So then this article goes on to say that essentially by setting up the contrast between Oryx and Crake and Ravenous, we can see that Ravenous is actually like a period piece that is clearly making a comment on Manifest Destiny because it's using the Wendigo as like a symbol in order to discuss what Westerners did when they arrived in California or other spots of the United States.
Yes, as DiMarco says, the disastrous results that occur when humans fail to act in moderation and cooperation.
Mm-hmm. So you've got this meta commentary going on in the film where Boyd, who's the Guy Pearce character, is struggling. He's trying not to give in to the Wendigo.
Right, he's trying not to be the thing that he has become.
Yeah, and it's explained to him by the Native American guide that lives with them. And then Calhoun / what's his real name? Colonel Ives?
Colonel Ives, yes.
Yeah, Robert Carlyle, has fully given into it and embraces it.
And DiMarco keeps saying that that Bird and Griffin use in this story the Native American character of George as a sort of a sign, a marker, a physical marker for how stories migrate and change, is one of the quotes. But that George is much more a symbol than a character. And in a way, that's also part of the critique that, George delivers the theme of the movie, but he delivers it in an unsubtitled foreign language, so that it has to be retranslated by Jeffrey Jones playing Colonel Hart to Guy Pearce playing Boyd, so that even when you have a indigenous person who knows what's up, you don't get to have the story directly from them. It has to be translated by the settlers, imperialists, colonists, aggressors, white people in the story.
Yeah, and so the article goes on to argue that translation prepares us as viewers for a revision of this indigenous tale, that we're not actually getting the full story, and specifically that they're using the Wendigo as a symbol for critiquing Manifest Destiny. Okay. Hart's translation is critical as a marking point for viewers watching the film, and how it uses the Wendigo and its associated cannibalistic qualities to critique Western consumption practices.
Which is even more complicated by the fact that Boyd is a veteran of the Mexican-American War.
Right. So, yeah, this film, I mean, like, on the face of it, it just seems like, oh, it's just this silly movie that failed at the box office. But it's like there's a lot going on underneath. Yeah.
DiMarco says that the Mexican-American War, also known as the North American Intervention by some Mexicans, is a historical signifier for paradox and opposing political alignments regarding land, government, and foreign trade. It serves well as the historical backdrop of choice for a tale about North American muscle flexing over land possession and a growing economy. And in fact, the opening scene, which shows a whole bunch of soldiers being given a chance to eat a steak in celebration of a war victory, is described by DiMarco as positioning Ravenous in the mire of conflicting ideologies regarding support of U.S. expansionism and patriotism, which is not necessary, right? The scene could have been done in a very different way to show you that Boyd is disgusted by meat. It didn't have to be an over-the-top consumption scene to give us this character beat about Boyd.
So then DiMarco turns to other literature, does a lit study of how cannibalism has been represented in fiction and other discourses, and turns to a scholar named Peter Holm, who is apparently like the expert on cannibalism stuff. And Holm, through other scholars, points out that the man-eating myth of cannibalism is still with us, but it's explicitly revealed to always be a story that's about ourselves and not others. The cannibal has been moved from the fringes of the world, and now it's in our very center. So I didn't mention this, but when I went to my video store to pick this up, I had some trouble finding it at first. Then they conveniently have like a laptop set up that allows you to search what sections movies are in. It was located under horror/cannibal films. There's an entire shelf of cannibal films at this movie store.
So what else was in the cannibal films? Because in the work that we're looking at here, there's this really careful distinction that one must understand a cannibal narrative as different from an undead cannibal narrative, as different from a vampire narrative. And in fact, this is what DiMarco and by way of home points out as the kind of interpolation of the Wendigo myth by Ravenous, that by making it very much about blood, it sort of implied that it was a vampire movie.
Yeah, right. Down to the point that Bird was associating it with Dracula.
Yeah, when that is not what the actual myth is about. If the story of Dracula is about repressed sexuality, the Wendigo myth is not about that.
Yeah, I think the Wendigo myth falls more under what Stephen King would call like the werewolf trope, right? Like if you stick with King's rules that there's like the werewolf, the vampire, and the thing, then this falls pretty heavily in the werewolf critique of the animalistic nature of humanity. Yeah,
the evil we're capable of, the ways that we can go bad. But I interrupted you before you could even begin answering my question. What else was on that section?
So, of course, like Cannibal Holocaust was up there. I have to be honest, like this isn't normally a genre I go for. There's some movies that fall under it that are social critiques that I like, and then there's others that are just kind of gore that I'm not particularly into. I've never seen Green Inferno, which is that Eli Roth movie that came out a couple of years ago. That was up there. Raw, which I've mentioned on our show before, the French cannibal movie. There's We Are What We Are, and then there's just like a bunch of B movies that are stuff like, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff that just has the word cannibal in the title.
Cannibal Cheerleaders,
Cannibal the Musical, Mars. Stuff like that, and Ravenous, of course.
So let's get to the end of this article and to the conclusion. The ultimate question about Ravenous, DiMarco says, which was released in 1999, may be what does it say about late 20th century culture? Atwood, Goldman, Hume, Kilgore, and others would most likely say that the emergence of the cannibal, here in the form of the Wendigo, reveals that humans have taken a wrong path by espousing only personal and national self-interest. The Wendigo, as a metaphorical construct, serves as a warning to audiences about their own participation in potentially oppressive systems. Wow, that doesn't sound like it applies to anything happening right now at all, Chris.
Well, I mean, when you get to the heart of it, Ravenous is a morality tale, and like huge spoilers for the movie, but like Robert Carlyle's ultimate plan is he's going to turn a bunch of officers in the military into Wendigos like him, and they're all going to live together at this fort, which is essentially like the pathway to California that settlers are going to come through. And their plan is that they're going to stay at this fort and just eat people discreetly every year.
Yeah. And remember, Carlyle doesn't think he's going to turn them into it. He thinks he's going to reveal to them how good it is.
Oh yeah, that they'll do it on their own, which is in the case is what Jeffrey Jones does.
So hiding behind this kind of personal, almost art house horror film is a really direct and I think effective critique of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism.
Yeah, and so like remember what we said, like Antonia Bird had made movies about socialist movements before doing this, so that's not all that surprising. And it seems like Griffin was on the set. One of the things that I think we skipped over was that Griffin was doing a bunch of rewrites on set in order to placate all the various directors that were coming on and off the film.
And as much as I like Griffin, I feel like it wouldn't exactly be that movie without Bird's influence.
Yeah, it's quite possible.
I don't think those were his themes. And one of the reasons I say that is because a lot of people point to Dashiell Hammett as someone that Ted Griffin said was an influence. That he was reading...
Algernon Blackwood, who wrote the infamous short story, The Wendigo.
Right. But in particular, he said, reading The Thin Man, which is a murder mystery and kind of a wisecracking... I mean, if you've seen the movie, it's almost a screwball comedy of a murder mystery. That was one of his influences for the script. And so... So Dashiell Hammett is not exactly the anti-colonialist, right? That would get you started on this story.
But ultimately, like, it comes down to one of the major themes of this film that a lot of people, including myself, missed out on, is that it's about America symbolically, but also our idea of California. It's located in California. It is, Carlisle said he sees it as being about L.A. Clearly, Bird had crossed to bear with Hollywood after her experiences. The experiences of how Hollywood interfered with this film made it also about Hollywood and L.A., but it was, in a larger sense, Europeans who were interacting with American business people who were using their own art to comment on their shitty behavior.
And it's funny to think that Ted Griffin, at 20 years into his career, would have been in the right place to do that same kind of satire, because he's been through some contested productions now and had his work misunderstood. But this was his first produced feature film screenplay.
So by my count, he was the only American with any like creative influence on what was going on. Everybody else was in some way or another European. Well, I guess if you count Ziskin, because according to the first director, Ziskin was making micro changes here and there.
Yeah, Ziskin was trying to keep it from being the critique of her business.
Yeah. So David Ehrlich wrote about Ravenous for Rolling Stone magazine and talked a bit about this theme of how it's about America, and said this ragged, unsung 1999 gem was one of the very few that was able to feed off of the chaos of a studio boondoggle. It's an origin story about the American spirit. The film is a lot like America itself. It's a melting pot of disparate elements that are thrown together in a fit of violence and galvanized by the righteous illusion that this is how God intended it to be.
I gotta say, I love that. I don't know how true it is, but that is a great quote.
Now, listeners, I feel like we have to pull back the curtain for a second here. Charlie and I are recording this.
Are you going to place this recording in space and time?
Yeah. As we're recording this, it's the morning after Iran has fired ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq as retaliation for the United States basically assassinating an Iranian general with an airstrike earlier in the week. So from our perspective, as we're recording this, it seems like we're on the precipice of war.
Yeah. And it's impossible to think about this immediate situation without having a sense of, if you follow all of these threads back, all the way to oil, becoming the necessary piece of energy for the world for a long time there, American intervention in Iran and Iraq in various ways, the coup that was supported by America, 2 wars in Iraq, and then finally, like, Trump being in the White House as kind of a critique of the attempt to decolonize, American interests. It just feels like this is the end result of a long series of assumptions and mischaracterizations of America's place in the world.
Yeah, and when you look at it in light of this, what seems like a silly cannibal movie from 20 years ago, the critique that it was making then about American ideology seems to be just as applicable today. I see this, if you layer this on top of the arguments that are going on social media right now about whether we should or should not go to war, it sort of lines up. It's pretty similar. And in fact, this piece, so let's turn back to Ehrlich's piece in Rolling Stone. He says the movie opens with an American flag waving in the wind and closes with a column of fresh corpses. Ravenous butchers the fantasy that the United States is a banquet with room for everyone at the table. This is a landscape where manifest destiny becomes a handy euphemism for all sorts of horrors, and a reminder that progress was never possible without savagery. And they go on to say, this may not be breaking news to the viewers, but the film isn't interested in telling you something that you don't already know. It's interested in showing it to you in a way that is so giddy and gruesome that you'll never be able to forget it.
Yeah, so to short circuit your ability to say, oh yeah, I understand that. I'm just trying to, exist in that system by being ridiculous, over the top, by connecting American policy and economic stances to cannibalism, you have to engage this thought.
And likewise, Ehrlich says this is probably why the movie was financially unsuccessful, because it's a story that is, quote, rubbing our faces in America's ongoing history of cultural, commercial, and otherwise cannibalism. It is going to be a tough sell in a country that still celebrates Columbus Day.
Yeah. And Ehrlich goes on to say that it's sort of amazing that this thing exists. A major studio trying to wrangle something so bloodthirsty and off-kilter is like a child trying to raise a feral hyena. It's too wild to tame, and it's always laughing at you for trying. But maybe this movie isn't quite as bleak as it appeared at the time. Maybe this is just a case of not being able to see the forest for the trees. For all its nihilism, this perverse take on the weird, weird West digs so deep into the darkness that it eventually shines a light out through the other side.
And Kayleigh Donaldson follows up in their sci-fi piece by saying, maybe what was going on here, and this is something we've already touched on, is that American audiences weren't ready for a British woman's nihilistic story about America's giddily violent history, and that it was made literal through stomach-churning horror. Like,
right, the gore here is the actual metaphor. It's not like an extra to the satire.
Yeah. So we've got this historical Western that's a horror and a comedy, and it's about greed and about how the original settlers themselves wreaked havoc all over their adopted homeland. That just seems to be too much for American audiences to be able to swallow, essentially. Again, no pun intended, when they just basically showed up thinking like, oh, this is just going to be like a scary, a wilderness movie.
Yeah, it also doesn't help. Do you know when this movie came out? Mid-March.
Is that right? Well, let's be honest. This is a movie that the production studio knew was a mess. They knew they were going to have a hard time selling it, and that is the best time of year to drop a movie like that.
Okay. We kept calling it a comedy. We keep talking about the humor. And that is something that is highlighted by all the people who try to understand it. And everyone just tries to figure out a way to say how black the comedy is. The blackest of black comedies, the jet black comedy. I mean, it's joking about death and violence and our capacity for it. Mm-hmm. Ehrlich says, Ravenous is a film that, by design, was forced to thread the needle between 3 different genres, a challenge that few directors have the finesse to overcome under normal circumstances, let alone on a project that had more cooks in the kitchen than it did carnivores on screen. This mulligan stew of a movie walks such a fine line between bleak comedy, he was licking me, hyper-violent survival drama, and supernatural creature feature that the guy narrating the trailer seems to have no idea what he's actually selling. Did you go back and watch the trailer?
I did not. I did not. Yeah.
The trailer is nuts. It's wrong. If you go look at the Ravenous trailer, which will not be of good quality because it's not like the studio has it up there for, archival purposes, but it just goes from beat to beat of the movie in a very odd way. I told you it uses Neil McDonough's comedy moment as the, smash cut for a horror moment. And the line, one man must choose between having dinner and being dinner.
Yeah. Well, that is technically true.
Yeah, but you were waiting for it. Imagine if that was what ends, like stuff on fire and blood on people's mouths and Guy Pearce looking really scared.
Yeah.
It was, it was a hard sell in terms of its comedy, even though, as Kaylee Donaldson says, the mood veers wildly from tense to hilarious, and Bird is happy to let the audience buy into both. When you're scared, you instinctively laugh to ease the tension, so why not go all the way?
Yeah.
And I do think that strategy is successful, but you can't explain that in a trailer.
Yeah. So remember, one of the things that Bird also mentioned, she didn't get final cut, and that they decided to open the film with these two quotes. And I think that was the American attempt to be like, this is comedy, because the two quotes, like one of them's a Nietzsche quote and the other one is just "eat me" by Anonymous.
Yeah. So this is how it goes. First you get, beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster, Friedrich Nietzsche. Followed by, eat me, Anonymous.
So it's both sides, the business side and the creative side, tried their best to start this movie off by saying, this is not to be taken seriously. This is farcical. It's satire, and it seemed to be lost on audiences.
Yeah, and notice that the sort of added stuff at the beginning, the studio Nietzsche quote followed by a gag quote versus Bird's actual start of this over-the-top eating scene that sets the tone. The Nietzsche and then "eat me" quotes are sort of like letting the tension out, letting the air out of a balloon.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas the banquet scene really is building to a cathartic and disgusting kind of entry into the movie.
And so, I mentioned earlier when we were talking about cannibal movies, I was like, I'm not really into cannibal movies. Like when I think about the cannibal shelf at my independent video store, most of those aren't things that I want to watch. And like I said, unless like cannibalism is being used for social commentary like it is in this film, the way that the film was marketed to people was not that way. It was marketed as, this is, you want to see people eat each other, you want to see this just gory, gruesome affair, this is the thriller of the year that you have to go check out. Shannon Ellery Hubble, who wrote about this film, says that it felt like it could be a torture porn movie. It was tinged with the supernatural, but it's actually a film that is centered around a sense of humor. It's comedy because it's commenting on society. Shannon says it's not a film that is self-aware in the sense of it's a spoof. It doesn't ridicule itself or the genre that it's coming from. Instead, it acknowledges the strangeness of its own premise and doubles down on it. So this film fascinates me because not only did it go through all of this, back and forth tug-of-war tension behind the scenes in terms of how it was getting made, not only did it fail in terms of finances when it went out to the audience that it was designed for, but like at the heart of it, the people who got the reins, who took over after all of the squabbling, really were able to make something that was pretty thoughtful and I guess in the Stephen Graham Jones sense of things, was permanent. You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @ChristianSager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.